the word that I would use to describe Sherman is busy. He is a very busy person, and I'm very grateful that he's given his time to talk to us today about his career trajectory. So Sherman's currently Head of Research Operations at the Wesley Research Institute, which is the official research partner for Uniting Care, and that encompasses 4 Uniting Care hospitals in Queensland. So prior to this role, he conducted his PhD at the University of Queensland under the supervision of Professor Josephine Forbes, and Sherman has published extensively in diabetes and endocrinology research, and some of that research has been recognised, through national media. He also has experience in clinical trials, which he's going to be talking to us about today. He's worked with startups, and this was all prior to his current role, where he's responsible for a clinical trial centre for biobanks, grant office and research programs that spans clinical and applied health sciences. And he also has held a number of voluntary appointments, such as being a member of one of the major human research ethics committees in Brisbane. So it really is a pleasure to hear from Sherman today. Just a reminder, the talk will be recorded. It'll be available to everybody afterwards. So please stay on mute, and we look forward to having a lot of really interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you again, Sherman. We're really looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jen, for the introduction, and thanks for having me on the seminar series. My name's Sherman. As Jen mentioned, I'm the Head of Research at Wesley, based here in Brisbane, and hopefully today I can share some interesting stories and my experience walking through my career to date, and in turn hopefully provide you with a bit of insight and hopefully helpful guidance and advice for what you may be feeling, or some of your colleagues may be feeling and thinking about in terms of academia and industry research. Right, so before I guess commence any further, I'm actually here in Brisbane, so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land up here in Brisbane, up in sunny Queensland, which are the Turrbal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And there's a few disclaimers here before I proceed any further. I've given talk of similar nature before, and I just want to highlight that the presentation is purely for educational purposes, doesn't replace independent professional judgment, and statements and facts presented here don't represent that of Wesley Research Institute and my employer. And obviously, before acting on any information within this presentation, please consider the appropriateness in regard to your own particular objectives, your financial situation, and seek independent advice. None of the information here is advice or recommendation to engage, I guess, in any particular research activity across academia or industry. And finally, obviously there's been reasonable effort to make sure the information is complete, but there's no liability here in terms of the errors and omissions in the content. So information is presented as is, and in terms of completeness, accuracy and timeliness, there are no guarantees or warranties, but obviously I'll do my best to make sure it's as accurate as possible. I think that's all the disclaimers up front. So I guess I'll kick off with a light introduction as to my background, and perhaps the main thing to highlight here is I certainly wasn't born into a research pedigree, and I don't have a family of professors or academics, and I was actually the first within my family to decide to embark on this journey. And personally on my end, I was a first generation Australian, so my heritage is from overseas. My mother was a teacher, my father worked in real estate, and eventually at one stage they decided to become small business owners, and they sold seafood across the southeast Queensland region. So a very different background to what I guess I'm doing right now, but just a bit of context that I guess I'm first in the family to embark on this journey. In terms of my education, I probably have a very standard education process here, and many people probably share the same educational backgrounds. I completed my undergraduate degree at Griffith University and completed my honours there too. I did a bit of teaching during my honours degree, which many people do, and as part of that I completed some training in how to appropriately deliver workshops and lectures, which was fortunately provided in kind from the university. And then I completed a PhD at Master Research, and rolled through the University of Queensland here in Brisbane. So very standard career trajectory so far, I guess, in terms of training and education. And as Jen mentioned, I was very fortunate to be able to publish a few exciting projects. And I guess the summary of probably one of the highlights is on the bottom of the screen, where we found a new treatment to potentially prevent diabetes in mice, which is now being investigated, I guess, clinically. I guess this is where my career trajectory kind of diverges a bit, and hopefully I'll be able to share the story of where I've headed to from here, warts and all, and I'll obviously also share some highlights of what I've experienced so far, but I'll also share some of the challenges and maybe some of the lessons learned as I navigated through my post-PhD periods, which involved both academic as well as industry-based positions. So many people, I suppose, ask the question, what do you do after a PhD? You've spent 3, 4, maybe 5 years labouring intensely in a very highly technical field, and you've completed a thesis, you've documented everything you found within a few hundred pages of your thesis documents. What do you do afterwards? And many people often default into a postdoctoral research fellowship, and that certainly wasn't where I headed. So hopefully that angle is a little bit unique, and I can share where I headed, I guess, on this slide. Before I finished my PhD, there were a few areas which were, for lack of a better term, quite trendy and very topical. And I decided in my final year of my PhD that it would be nice to see if any of these interesting topics which piqued my interest had traction in terms of a career. And one of those topics is probably, it's not particularly new or innovative, it's the term of industry, and it's the term of entrepreneurship, and that was certainly very topical when I was completing my higher degree research. To support that interest and to scratch that itch, I joined a few incubator programs aimed at spinning out or starting up early stage initiatives and early stage businesses, and one was called iLab, which was based at the University of Queensland, UQ, and the other one was called Health Hack, which was, I think that was an independent entity altogether. Coding was also very topical at the time, and I think it actually still is topical. And myself and one of my colleagues within the Research Institute actually decided to give it a shot and spin out a startup business, which was wasn't a very large business. It was a mobile application, but we incorporated and put together a business plan to launch that application. And I was also interested in a few other things, and some of them weren't trendy, unfortunately, but I still found them interesting. And particularly, I was quite interested in ethics and the ethics of research, particularly clinical research. So I joined a Human Research Ethics Committee, a HREC, up here in Brisbane, just to get a feel and further my understanding as to how ethical considerations come into play, I guess, on the other end of the seesaw. And I guess to summarise some of the more exciting parts here, which is probably the industry, entrepreneurship and coding itches from iLab and from Health Hack, and myself and a colleague spun out the company called Pager, and this was, it wasn't actually too much of an ingenious idea. Essentially, it was a platform aimed at joining together HDR students across Australia. And we launched it in Brisbane to begin with, but we had seen another attempt of this, I think it was over in the States, which was unsuccessful. We tried to take on board some lessons learned there. We eventually did launch the application into the iOS and the Google Play stores for Apple and Android phones, which was quite fun, quite exciting, and we got some good uptake locally within the Brisbane area, but we certainly decided that we didn't quite have the traction or the funding required to take it further, and it ended up being in what the program is called App Graveyard, but it was quite an interesting experience, and both of us learnt a lot, and certainly myself took on a lot of lessons learned in terms of business plans, MVPs, value propositions, and all of that commercial acumen, which is quite important. So this was all, I guess, done during my final year or so of my PhD. I kind of took it on board as a bit of a side hobby, just to see what was out there and to see whether or not my interests could actually gain traction into creating a job. But I had to face reality at some point, and the reality was I probably needed to do a bit more learning and to get a first job in the real world before I embarked on my own little journeys. So my first role outside of my PhD wasn't actually in academia. I decided quite early on that there was a much larger world out there, and I was very eager to see how they operated and how the real world operated, so to speak. My first role was at a small startup company. It was a biotech that was spun out from some research at the University of Queensland called Microbial Life Sciences, and it's currently listed on the ASX. But certainly when I started there, it wasn't publicly listed, and I was working there as a research coordinator, which I actually very much enjoyed. And I guess what I'll do in this presentation today as I go through it is I'll share, in terms of structure, some of the highlights, some of the lessons learned, and I'll try and also distill through some take-home messages, at least for myself, that I found through these experiences. My first role at Microba, I think, was a very, very fortuitous one, and I certainly enjoyed it. And one of the major take-home lessons that I had here in terms of how to operate was how to work inside the corporate environment. And this is probably the same for many people who take their first corporate role outside of academia. So this part probably isn't unique, but as an example, some of the basics about how to work appropriate hours, how to communicate appropriately in a corporate environment, and the structure of a corporate business is obviously quite different to academia, which can obviously change between labs, but certainly structure was very so it was a bit of a change for myself, which I adapted to. As a research coordinator, I was actually very fortunate. Again, being a startup, there were many different activities and functional teams that I had the luck to be able to work with, and I didn't have to stay very much narrowly within my own lane, which was quite good. I learned a lot about contracts. I learned a little bit about clients, about sales, about real world deadlines, and I have in here in inverted commas how to think. And I think this is probably a key one for myself, and I think many people find the same, that when they enter the real world, how you think critically and how you achieve set deadlines and set goals does dramatically alter within your first year of getting the job. And very luckily, I was surrounded by some of what I thought at the time and still think were some of the brightest minds in the industry, both commercially and scientifically. So I had lots of people to learn off. And I also did some self-directed education just to formalise some of the best practice mechanisms out there, particularly in terms of project management. It was called the Prince 2 course. So what were some of the challenges here? I mean, not everything's shiny. Some of the challenges here, in particular in the environment that I was in, was working within a startup biotech. It had lots of opportunity, which is great. But obviously, on the other end, counterbalancing that is that everything is new, and that was a challenge. And speaking to what I mentioned before in terms of take-home lessons, personally for myself, working in the corporate environment really made me, I guess, improve how I thought critically, and particularly being a startup environment, it made me think about things within what they call first principles. So coming back to the why, before anything is done, why are we doing it? Why is it done this way? And if there's a better way, instead of just blindly going forward, thinking about a better way forward. So I had a very good experience in Microba, and I guess if I was to summarise a few highlights just for context, we were lucky enough to work with a few high-profile clients, including with the National Rugby League. I don't think down south everyone follows the rugby league, but we certainly do up here in Queensland, and we were lucky enough to run a project with the national teams, the male and the female national teams, the Kangaroos and Jillaroos, and we analysed the gut microbiome with a few of the athletes and tried to pull out associations in that, in addition to the dietary intake. And perhaps one interesting fact I found here was that the Jillaroos, the female athletes, had pristine diets, and they counted all the calories and ate very well, whereas the men, obviously, within the rugby league, as many people may know, have very different diets. Some of them eat lots of KFC and fast food. So that was my first, I guess, taste of the corporate world in research, and it was very fun, and I thought I couldn't get enough of it. And the next role that I held until recently was actually also in the commercial sphere, and specifically was within clinical trials. So I certainly had a taste of clinical research and clinical trials within Microba in my first position, but I wanted to learn more. I wanted to see what I guess the benchmark is in terms of conducting clinical research. So I joined an organisation called Nucleus Network, which is Melbourne-based, but at the time they were expanding and had recently acquired a Brisbane clinic, which is very close to home. So I applied for the role and was lucky enough to be offered a position there as their team lead. And this was a great role. It was a bit of a trial by fire because it was my first role in line management, as is the case often with many people. So in terms of lessons learnt, I learned a lot about the fundamentals of line management, and I think this is one of those soft skills where you can read a textbook as much as you want, but until you actually do it, you don't learn the lessons that you need to learn until then. Technically, I really furthered my understanding of clinical trials, and in particular, I'll highlight a few things here, including some of the technical processes, things such as consent forms, PRCFs, how to use source documents, logs, case report forms, CRFs, and electronic database capture, EDCs. I learned a lot about the overarching frameworks in clinical trials, including good clinical practice, GCP, good documentation practice, GDP, national statement, Declaration of Helsinki, many things that I think people on the call will be familiar with. I learned a lot about quality, and particularly in the past decade or so, as clinical trials becomes more and more mainstream, there's more and more attention, there's an increasing focus on quality. So I learned a lot about how to run what they call CAPAs, which I think is a corporate acronym. It stands for corrective and preventative actions, how to do FMEAs, which is a failure mode effects analyses, and how to do root cause analyses to find out what's really wrong to improve quality in what we do. And I guess working into my first frontline leadership role, learning to think at the systems level was quite a bit of a mindset change. And to complement, I guess, the hands-on practical learning, I tried to further my education and project management. So I completed a bit more of the Prince 2 course that I had originally completed a year or so ago, and completed, I guess, the next level up, which was called the Prince 2 practitioner course. And I actually found that quite helpful, really helped me solidify best practice and also apply it to the role that I was doing at the time. The next slide that I'll kind of share with everyone here is a list of challenges and take-home messages, and I guess I'll draw everyone's eye towards the title of the slide. I joined the organisation at the time when we went through a pandemic, so there were certainly many lessons learned, and they weren't all focused on COVID-19, but certainly COVID-19 helped crystallise some of the challenges that I felt throughout this period. I guess the first challenge here is that working in a large organisation like Nucleus Network came with its intrinsic challenges of working within a high volume or high number business, and coming from a startup, I think that change was particularly clear and frank for myself. So there was some adjustment periods required there. I joined in the Brisbane clinic for Nucleus after it had recently been acquired, with the headquarters for the organisation being in Melbourne. So there's some unique challenges there in terms of, I guess, being able to adopt company process towards a new business. The COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned, happened in late 2019 into 2020 and 2021, 2022, and arguably ongoing. But certainly there were lots of challenges there in terms of conducting business as usual. There were many health-related precautions in terms of masks and testing. There were many human resource or HR-related inquiries in terms of, can I come into work? Can I work remote? What can you reasonably do to make work possible from home? And at the very peak of COVID-19, there were also challenges and conversations in terms of stand down. You know, if there was no work to be able to be done, how do we keep the business afloat? How do we keep our team afloat? And those were some particularly curly circumstances, but we certainly got through it. And for our neighbours down south in Brisbane, we also had a flood in 2022, which was fun. So a lot of lessons learned there in terms of business continuity, patients and staff couldn't get to work because the roads were flooded. How do we make sure that everyone still remains safe? How do we do welfare check-ins? How do we do teleconsults? And I guess these two major events helped crystallise some of that. So a few of the take-home lessons here, and I do reflect back on my time at Nucleus as being a very valuable training period for myself in terms of line management in particular, and I've increasingly appreciated that line management certainly isn't art. I mentioned that you can't read how to do line management in the textbook. I mean, you can, but you won't really know how to apply it. But it's an ongoing journey, and even right now, I'm continuing to try and improve my line management. But this is where it started. Thinking at a systems level was certainly something that was quite important here. Coming from a small startup where everything was very personalised into a high volume, high staff number of business, everything needed to be scalable, everything needed to be disseminatable across different sites, Melbourne, Brisbane, and eventually at some stage into Minneapolis in the USA. So instead of thinking of the person, we keep the person at the centre, but think how the systems can suit them. And in light of COVID-19, some of the flooding events and the constant change in the regulatory environments, one of the lessons here I learned was that the only thing we can really expect to be constant is change. So controlling what we can and understanding where your sphere of influence really ends was another lesson learned for myself here. And there's a diagram up here which I put on the slide just out of interest, because this was probably one of the more interesting graphs and schematics I was shown during my time at the organisation, and it's really a quadrantal schematic based on how you deal with leadership and how you deal with your staff and your employees. And essentially on the x-axis there's a scale running from silence to challenging. How you provide feedback, how you communicate with your staff, and on the y-axis up to down, up to bottom, there's a scale in terms of how much you care about somebody versus not caring about somebody. And we had a professional coach come on site once showing us this graph, and it's always been a graph I remembered. And I remember because he circled the category in the top right hand corner which says radical candor, and he said that's where you want to be. And some people who follow Simon Sinek on YouTube may have heard of this too, but radical candor is essentially where you create a safe environment for your staff, you care for them, you ask them how they're going, but at the same time you challenge them to grow, and that's essentially where you want to be. So in terms of line management, that's where one of the big take-home messages I had from that company. In terms of a few highlights, there were so many highlights within that organisation, and perhaps one of the ones that I have in the front of mind are some of the COVID-19 clinical trials. And one of the trials that we ran there in the phase 1 environments eventually made it to market, which was quite exciting, quite fulfilling, which was the Novavax COVID-19 vaccine, the Nuvaxovid vaccine, and that's now approved across a few jurisdictions, including FDA, TGA here in Australia, and EMEA over in Europe, and obviously resulted in some nice publications. And we also worked on the University of Queensland COVID-19 study, which had some quite a good safety profile, but unfortunately had some results that resulted in not progressing any further. And I guess this is where I kind of come full circle, and as you can probably appreciate, following my education, I haven't really touched academia. I've kind of navigated through a few corporate commercial roles, but I've since headed back into the land of academic research, and I'm currently working at Wesley Research Institute based at the Wesley Hospital in Brisbane. And the title of the slide is Straddling Industry and Academia, and I truly think I've come into a role where I'm trying to do both and wear both hats. Because we really do both here at Wesley. We don't purely do academic research. So what are some of the areas of growth and learning and opportunity here? Well, for myself, this role was my first role in executive leadership. So learning how to lead leaders as opposed to learning how to lead, which has its own particular nuances. Blending corporate and academic work structures against different teams, and I'll share a bit more about this at the bottom of the slide in 1 second, but certainly we don't just do commercial work here, we don't just do academic work, we really do both types of work. Furthering my understanding of how research institutes as a business work in terms of their frameworks, and I'm in particular learning about cross-institutional contracting and negotiations with universities and for-profits, learning about IP and commercialisation, trying to improve the academic research sustainability, and this is again not a unique problem. I think many universities and institutes face this, but having important conversations about contract lengths, funding, KPIs, and again trying to take these back to first principles, how do we do this better? Who's doing this well in the world, and can we copy or learn from them? And as you probably also noticed, I do tend to try to continuously learn, and there is a bit of self-directed education I'd like to do at some point, but certainly haven't formalised that yet. And I guess just to kind of visually summarise what we do here at the Wesley, we do have a few functions on the left-hand side, the three jigsaw pieces on the left, which have both academic and commercial flavours. The Clinical Trial Centre has both industry-led and commercial and academic flavours. The Biobank runs industry and investigator-led academic projects, and the health services team certainly runs both purely academic as well as contracted work with corporates. Over on the right-hand side, the yellow and the blue jigsaw pieces, we have the celiac disease program and our newly emerging spatial biology program, which are both largely, by far and large, academic programs. And we also have obviously a research office, which is the enabler and makes it all happen. And without them, I don't think we'd have any of these research functions. But we certainly, as you can probably appreciate from the jigsaw schematic at the bottom, we cross both traditional academic research as well as commercial and corporate flavours. So what are the challenges in this role? I have a few here that I'll share. Balancing the needs of industry activities in-house without compromising the academic focus of the Institute certainly is a challenge. And I've enjoyed straddling both industry and academic research, but being able to balance and strike that right ratio really is an ongoing area of focus. I'm learning from industry best practices to benefit academic functions, and what I mean specifically about this is learning how industry does certain aspects better, such as performance management, KPI structure, and learning how academia can potentially benefit from that, at least in-house here at the Institute. Learning and leveraging global leaders in industry and academia to lift our performance, and this means looking further beyond the horizon, so looking across Australia, but also into Europe and USA to see how some of the world-leading institutes do what they do best. And some of the take-home lessons I think really are a little bit too early to be seen, but hopefully the challenges highlight a few of the lessons learned so far for myself. And I guess if I was to pull together a few highlights in terms of what we do here, our Clinical Trial Centre is very active across numerous indications. We run celiac disease gastroenterology trials, we run ALS motor neurone disease studies, we have rare disease commercial projects, we have neurology projects, cardiovascular projects, and oncology. In terms of our biobank, some of the standouts here, we hold the Australian Autism Biobank, we have the Queensland Brain Tumour Biobank, we also have a few industry partners. Our health services research team is currently building a virtual hospital, which is not a small ordeal, and we also have a mental health navigation service in Far North Queensland, helping provide particular mining towns with a yellow pages of where to go if they need help. In the celiac disease program, we have a few projects, including the microbiome, dental enamel and case finding projects. And I guess just at the bottom, there's a few highlights in terms of what we're doing. We have the Autism Biobank on the right, and we have our National Ataxia Telangiectasia Clinic, which we host here in terms of neurology and rare disease, which we are conducting a phase 2 study on so far. So I guess if I was to summarise everything that I discussed today, and I'm happy to share more as well after the presentation and Q&A, this is how I've visualized in my head how academic research and industry research works. And on the left hand side you have traditional investigator-led curiosity driven research, usually in a university or research setting, and on the right hand side we have industry research, which is normally more end product focused, more commercially focused, and usually it's conducted by an incorporated business, incorporated entity. And in between, I think historically a lot of people view this chasm where you have to jump with your briefcase, but I don't think that's really true anymore. And I think increasingly people appreciate that the chasm's very, very minimal. And particularly in my end, I've appreciated as far as my career progresses further and further, the chasm becomes smaller and smaller. You need to be able to work in both arenas. So I guess the final slide here in terms of general observations, again, these aren't recommendations specific to anyone's circumstances, but for myself, what I found helpful is you should always find something that interests you. If you love what you do, yes, it'll still be hard, but at least you like it. Again, keep an open mind. Industry is not the devil. A lot of people describe industry as the dark side, but I certainly don't resonate with that. It's fulfilling in its own fulfilling in its own right. It's challenging in its own respects. And finally, I'd also say don't be afraid to learn something completely new. There's an acronym I've put up here on screen.
Sorry.
There's an acronym that I put up here on screen called WYSIATA. It's an acronym coined by I think it's Professor Daniel Kahneman from Stanford. Essentially, it stands for what you see is all there is. And certainly, if you don't branch out beyond your horizons, you don't know what's out there. So don't be afraid to learn something completely new. And I guess just to finish off, this is a bit of a roadmap. And you know, going from your first few roles to your next few roles, it's not a linear path. It's very curvy. But I've certainly learned to embrace that because that's reality and that's how it works. So thank you everyone for your time today, and I guess this is what I had prepared for presentation. And obviously, if there's any questions, I'm very happy to do my best to field them.